My name is Rachel. I'm 34 years old. And the day I buried my mother, I also buried the last shred of loyalty I had for my brother. It happened in front of everyone. Aunts, uncles, cousins who hadn't spoken to us in years but showed up because death has a way of making people suddenly care. The reception was at a country club my mother could never have afforded when she was alive, paid for with money that should have been mine. My brother Marcus stood near the buffet table, shaking hands and accepting condolences like he was the grieving son of the year. He wore an expensive suit I'd never seen before, custom-tailored, the kind that whispered money without shouting it. His wife clung to his arm in a black dress that probably cost more than my rent. And I watched them from across the room, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, knowing that in about 10 minutes I was going to destroy him. If you've ever had someone steal from you while pretending to comfort you, if you've ever smiled through a betrayal so deep it changed your DNA, stay with me. Because what happened at that funeral didn't start with my mother's death. It started 3 years earlier when she got sick, and my brother saw an opportunity. My mother, Linda, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember because I was supposed to meet a friend for dinner that night, and I never made it. I sat in a hospital waiting room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while a doctor with kind eyes explained words like metastatic and palliative and months, not years. Marcus arrived 2 hours late, smelling like cologne and making excuses about traffic. Mom reached for both our hands and made us promise we'd take care of each other. I promised and meant it. Marcus promised, and I should have known better. She had a will. A simple one drafted years ago when Dad died, splitting everything 50-50 between us. The house in Jersey, her small savings account, a life insurance policy through her job at the utility company where she'd worked for 30 years. It wasn't a fortune, maybe $350,000 total if you sold everything and added it up, but it was hers. It was supposed to be her legacy to the 2 children she raised alone after our father's heart attack. I want you both to be okay, she said that day in the hospital, squeezing our hands. Promise me you'll be fair to each other. Marcus looked her in the eye and said, "Of course, Mom, we're family." If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people. The first 6 months of her illness, I was there. I'm talking every day. I lived 40 minutes away in a cramped apartment in Hoboken, working as a project manager for a marketing firm that demanded 60-hour weeks. But I drove to Jersey after work, sat with her through chemo sessions that left her gray and hollow, held her hair when she vomited, learned to cook the bland foods she could keep down. I brought her books she was too tired to read and played old movies on my laptop while she dozed. Marcus lived 20 minutes closer in a newly renovated condo with his wife Amanda and their 2 kids. He showed up once a week if that, always with an excuse. The kids had soccer. Amanda wasn't feeling well. Work was crazy. He managed a car dealership and made decent money, enough that his excuses felt especially thin. When he did visit, he'd stay for an hour, talk about himself, then leave. Mom never complained. She'd always favored him in that quiet way mothers do with their difficult children, the ones who need more grace because they give less. "Your brother is busy," she'd say when I'd mention his absence. "He's got a family to think about." I didn't argue. I just showed up. By month 9, hospice came into the picture. Mom wanted to die at home, in the house where she'd raised us, surrounded by things that smelled like her life. I took FMLA leave from work, moved into my childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and posters I'd never taken down, and became her full-time caretaker. I learned to administer morphine, change bedsheets with her still in them, recognize the difference between pain and panic. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Some nights I'd sit on the bathroom floor after she finally fell asleep and cry so hard I thought I'd crack apart. Marcus increased his visits to twice a week, mostly because Amanda told him it looked bad. I knew because I overheard her hissing at him in the driveway one evening. "Your sister is doing everything and people are starting to talk." He'd arrive with flowers, stay for 30 minutes, then disappear. During one of those visits, about 2 weeks before Mom died, he asked to see her paperwork. I was in the kitchen heating up soup when he came in holding a folder he'd pulled from her desk. "Does Mom have everything in order?" he asked, too casually. "You know, like legally." I told him yes, she'd updated her will 5 years ago with a lawyer in town and everything was filed properly. He nodded, said something about wanting to make sure we didn't have to deal with complicated stuff after, and I actually thought he was being responsible for once. I was so stupid. Mom died on a Sunday morning in October. The hospice nurse had warned me it was close, that her breathing had changed, that it would be hours, not days. I called Marcus at 6 a.m. and told him if he wanted to say goodbye, he needed to come now. He made it by 9. We sat on either side of her bed, each holding one of her hands, and watched her slip away so quietly it felt like she just decided to stop. The nurse checked her pulse, nodded gently, and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Marcus cried. I didn't. I was too empty. The next few days blurred together in a fog of phone calls and arrangements. I contacted the funeral home, picked out a casket that felt both too expensive and not expensive enough, wrote an obituary that couldn't possibly capture who she was. Marcus helped with some calls, nodded along to decisions, played the supportive brother role well enough that I almost forgot to watch him closely. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday. We agreed to meet with Mom's lawyer, a man named Gerald Hoffman, that Wednesday to go over the will and start the estate process. I assumed it would be straightforward. Read the will, sign some papers, begin the painful work of dismantling a life. Wednesday morning, I put on the one black dress I owned that wasn't too casual and drove to Hoffman's office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Marcus was already there, sitting in the waiting room scrolling through his phone. We were called in together. Hoffman was older, maybe 70, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle demeanor that probably served him well in a job built around death and money. He offered condolences, asked us to sit, and opened a file on his desk. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "I have to inform you that your mother's will was updated 4 months ago." I stared at him. "What?" He slid a document across the desk. "She came in with your brother in June and made some changes to the distribution of assets." I looked at Marcus. His face was carefully neutral, but I caught something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like guilt trying to hide behind preparation. My hands shook as I picked up the paper. The new will was short. It left me $25,000 and a few pieces of jewelry. Everything else, the house, the savings, the life insurance, went to Marcus. The reason listed was that Marcus had taken on significant financial burden caring for her in her final months and needed the resources to support his young family. I couldn't breathe. The room tilted. 4 months ago was July. July when I was sleeping in my childhood bedroom, crushing pills into applesauce, bathing my dying mother. July when Marcus was showing up twice a week for 30-minute visits. I looked up at Hoffman, then at my brother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "This isn't right," I said. My voice sounded far away. "She wouldn't do this." Hoffman folded his hands. "I understand this is difficult, but your mother was of sound mind when she made these changes. She signed in front of me and a witness. It's legally binding." "How?" I asked. "How did this happen?" Marcus finally spoke. "Mom called me one day, said she was worried about her finances, about making sure things were handled properly. I took her to update everything. She made her own choices, Rachel." That was a lie. I knew it bone deep. Mom could barely get out of bed in July. She was on heavy pain medication. There was no way she called him asking to rewrite her will unless he planted the idea first, unless he convinced her while she was weak and terrified and not thinking clearly. And sound mind. She was dying, confused, desperate to not be a burden. I wanted to flip the table. Instead, I asked Hoffman, "Can this be contested?" He hesitated. "You can try." But it would require proof that she was coerced or mentally incapacitated at the time of signing. That's very difficult to prove, and it would mean a long legal battle. Expensive. I looked at Marcus again. He'd planned this, timed it, waited until she was vulnerable, until I was too exhausted and buried in caretaking to notice him circling. Took her to a lawyer, probably fed her lines about protecting the grandkids, about me being young and capable while he had responsibilities. And she'd believed him because she always did. I stood up. I didn't trust myself to speak. Hoffman said something about being in touch, about next steps, but I was already walking out. In the parking lot, Marcus caught up with me. "Rachel, wait," I spun around. "You stole from me." He had the audacity to look offended. "I didn't steal anything. Mom made a decision while she was dying and you manipulated her." His jaw tightened. "I have 2 kids and a mortgage. You're single with no dependents. She wanted to make sure her grandchildren were taken care of." I laughed, sharp and bitter. "You make 6 figures selling cars. I gave up my job to wipe her mouth when she couldn't swallow. Don't you dare talk to me about sacrifice." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you try to fight this, you'll lose. And you'll spend whatever you do get on lawyers. Take the 25,000 and move on. That's when I knew. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't conflicted. He'd calculated this coldly, factored in my grief and exhaustion, bet that I wouldn't have the energy or resources to fight. And he was almost right. I got in my car and sat there for 20 minutes, shaking with rage so pure I thought I'd combust. Then I called the hospice nurse who'd been with us at the end, a woman named Karen who'd seen everything. I asked her to meet me for coffee. 2 hours later, we sat in a corner booth at a diner and I told her what happened. She listened, her face hardening. Your brother was barely there, she said quietly. I documented every visit. It's all in my notes. Can I get a copy of those notes? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. You were a good daughter, Rachel. Someone should know that. Next, I called Mom's friends, the women from her church group who'd visited during her illness, brought casseroles, sat with her when I needed to shower or sleep. I asked careful questions. Had Marcus ever come alone? Had Mom seemed confused or pressured? One woman, Margaret, admitted that she'd been there once when Marcus arrived with paperwork. Your mother seemed upset after he left, she said. She kept saying she hoped she did the right thing. I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. Karen sent me her hospice records showing Marcus's minimal presence and my constant care. Margaret and 2 other church friends wrote statements about what they'd witnessed. I found texts on Mom's phone, ones I'd backed up to the cloud, where Marcus had pushed her about financial planning and making sure the grandkids would be okay. The messages had a tone, subtle but there, that felt like pressure wrapped in concern. I contacted a lawyer specializing in estate disputes. She reviewed everything and said I had a case, but it would cost at least $40,000 to pursue and could take a year or more. Money I didn't have. Time that would keep me chained to this nightmare while Marcus lived in Mom's house and spent her savings. I was about to give up when I remembered something. 3 years ago, Marcus had gotten into trouble. Serious trouble. He'd been skimming money from the dealership, falsifying sales records to boost his commission numbers. I only knew because he'd called me panicking one night, drunk and terrified, saying he was about to be audited and could lose everything. He begged me not to tell Mom because it would kill her. Promised he'd fixed it, paid everything back, made it go away. I'd kept his secret because that's what you do for family, right? You protect them even when they don't deserve it. But now I wondered, had he really fixed it? Or had he just buried it better? I made some calls. Used connections from my marketing job to reach someone who knew someone in dealership management. Asked vague questions about employee audits and financial irregularities. Found out that 3 years ago there had been an internal investigation at Marcus's dealership, and while charges weren't filed, he'd been quietly moved to a different location and put on probation. The records existed. They were just sealed as part of a settlement agreement. I also learned something else. 6 months ago, right around when he started getting cozy with Mom's estate plans, Marcus had taken out a second mortgage on his condo. Then a month later, he'd bought a boat. An expensive one. The kind of financial decision that didn't make sense unless you were expecting money to come in, unless you'd already planned for it. The pieces fell into place. Marcus hadn't just manipulated Mom on impulse. He'd been financially desperate, leveraged to his eyeballs, and saw her illness as a solution. My inheritance wasn't collateral damage. It was calculated theft. I sat with that knowledge for 2 days, let it crystallize into something cold and useful. Then I made a decision. I wasn't going to contest the will in court. I was going to let Marcus think he'd won. And then at Mom's funeral, in front of everyone who mattered, I was going to tell the truth. Not just about the will, about all of it. I spent the days before the funeral preparing. I typed up a document, clean and factual, outlining the timeline of Marcus's manipulation. Attached copies of the hospice records showing his absence. Included Margaret's statement. Added screenshots of the texts where he'd pressured Mom. And then, because I wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything, I included the information about his past financial misconduct at the dealership and his recent reckless spending. I had copies made, 50 of them, tucked them into folders with Mom's name on the front. The funeral itself was beautiful in that terrible way funerals are. The flowers were perfect. The service was dignified. People said kind things about a woman they'd barely known, and I stood there nodding, accepting hugs, playing my role. Marcus gave a eulogy, talked about what an amazing mother she was, how much she'd sacrificed, how she'd taught him the importance of family. His voice cracked in all the right places. People dabbed their eyes. I wanted to scream. Afterward, at the reception, I waited. Let people eat, drink, settle into that uncomfortable social space between grief and relief that it's not them in the casket. Marcus held court near the bar, laughing softly at some story an uncle was telling, his arm around Amanda, who looked appropriately somber in her designer grief. I walked to the front of the room and picked up a glass, tapping it gently with a fork. The sound cut through the murmur of conversation. People turned. Marcus looked up, confused. "I'd like to say a few words," I announced. My voice was steady, calm, dangerous. Marcus's face shifted slightly, some instinct telling him this wasn't going to be a sweet tribute. I started by thanking everyone for coming, said how much Mom would have appreciated seeing everyone together. Then I pivoted. "My mother died believing she was doing the right thing for her children," I said. "She died thinking she was protecting her grandchildren's future. But she died not knowing the full truth about how her final wishes were manipulated." The room went silent. You could hear ice shifting in glasses. "What are you doing?" Marcus said quietly, but I ignored him. 3 months before she died, while I was caring for her full time, my brother took her to a lawyer and convinced her to rewrite her will, leaving me almost nothing and taking nearly everything for himself. I held up the folders. "This contains the evidence. Hospice records showing who was actually there. Witness statements. Text messages. All of it showing a pattern of manipulation against a dying woman." I started walking through the room, handing folders to relatives, to Mom's friends, to Marcus's coworkers who'd shown up. People opened them immediately, unable to resist. Amanda's face went white as she scanned the first page. An aunt gasped. Marcus lunged toward me. "Rachel, stop. You're grieving, you're not thinking clearly." But I stepped back, and 2 of Mom's church friends physically moved between us, their faces hard. I kept going. "And because I believe in complete honesty, you should also know that my brother has a history of financial fraud. 3 years ago, he was investigated for embezzling from his employer. 6 months ago, he mortgaged his home to the hilt. He didn't change Mom's will because he needed it. He changed it because he's drowning in debt from his own bad choices and saw our dying mother as a bank." Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. The room erupted, not in my defense or his, just in pure chaos. People shouting questions, Amanda crying, Marcus red-faced and trying to grab folders out of people's hands while simultaneously denying everything. His boss, a man I recognized from dealership events, stood up and walked out without a word, folder tucked under his arm. That's when I knew Marcus's career was over. You can't have your dirty laundry aired at a funeral in front of your employer and survive it professionally. An uncle, my father's brother, who'd always been the family moral compass, stepped forward and looked at Marcus with pure disgust. "You did this to your own mother? While she was dying." Marcus tried to appeal to him. "She wanted me to have it." "Uncle Jim, you know I've got kids to think about." Jim cut him off. "I know you're a coward and a thief. Your father would be ashamed." That broke something in Marcus. He started yelling at me, calling me vindictive, saying I was destroying the family over money I didn't even need, that I was jealous of his life and always had been. I just stood there and let him unravel, because the truth was doing the work for me. Amanda grabbed his arm, hissing that they needed to leave. As they pushed toward the exit, she turned back to me with tears streaming down her face and said, "You just destroyed my children's lives. I hope you're happy." I wasn't happy. But I was done being silent. After they left, the reception dissolved quickly. Some people hugged me and whispered support. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the messiness of it all. Margaret squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother knows what you did for her. That's what matters." I stayed until the venue staff started cleaning up, then drove back to the house I'd grown up in, the one that legally belonged to Marcus now but felt haunted by everything that had happened in it. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Marcus's lawyer. He wanted to settle. Turns out the public exposure combined with his employer reopening their investigation into his past conduct had made his life unmanageable. Amanda had left him, taking the kids to her mother's. The dealership had fired him, and without his income, he couldn't afford the mortgages on either property. The settlement offer was simple. We'd split everything 50-50 like the original will intended. He'd sell Mom's house and we'd divide the proceeds. He'd cash out the life insurance and give me half. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue further legal action or share any more information publicly. I agreed. Not because I forgave him, but because I'd already gotten what I needed. The money was never the point. The point was making sure he understood that theft has consequences, that you can't build a life on someone else's pain and expect it to stand. 3 months after the funeral, I received a cashier's check for $173,000, my half of Mom's estate. I deposited it and then donated $25,000 to the hospice organization that had cared for her, in her name. The rest I invested carefully, the way she would have wanted. Marcus moved into a rental apartment in a different town. Last I heard, he was working in furniture sales and avoiding family gatherings. We haven't spoken since. Sometimes people ask if I regret what I did at the funeral, if I wish I'd handled it privately. The answer is no, because silence protects the wrong people. It lets thieves rebrand themselves as victims and manipulators rewrite history. What I did was loud and messy and probably made me look vindictive to people who didn't understand the full story. But it was also honest. And in a family built on decades of quiet enabling and looking the other way, honesty was the most radical thing I could offer. My mother spent her whole life trying to keep the peace, sacrificing herself so Marcus could stay comfortable. In the end, that instinct made her vulnerable to his worst impulses. I refused to honor her memory by continuing that pattern. So yes, I revealed his secret at her funeral. I watched his life collapse in real time, and I'd do it again. If this shocked you, comment exposed below. Because sometimes justice isn't about courtrooms and lawyers. Sometimes it's about standing in a room full of people who'd rather pretend everything is fine and forcing them to see the truth. Sometimes it's about choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort. And sometimes the inheritance that matters most isn't money. It's the refusal to let cruelty hide behind family loyalty. If you believe people like Marcus deserve to be exposed, hit the like button so this reaches others who need to hear it. Comment below telling me what you would have done in my situation. Would you have stayed silent or burned it all down? And subscribe, because I share real stories about family betrayal, financial manipulation, and the cost of choosing yourself. More people need to understand what hiding in plain sight looks like. My name is Rachel. I'm 34 years old. And the day I buried my mother, I made sure my brother's lies were buried with her.